Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome to the Bill Walton Show. I'm Bill Walton. Recently, I came across an extraordinary and, for me, shocking report by a past guest on this show, Dr. Vincent Pry. It's called Surprise Attack, ICBMs and the Real Nuclear Threat. It provides an excellent overview of nuclear war, past, present, and future. We don't like to think or even talk much about the possibilities of nuclear war, but they are real. Vladimir Putin's Russia, Communist China, and of course North Korea are implementing comprehensive programs to strengthen their ability to wage nuclear war. Meanwhile, as Dr. Pry puts it, on nuclear matters, the U.S. And Western strategic culture mostly thinks and acts in a state of denial and unreality. Dr. Vincent Pry has vast experience in national security, where to name just a few roles, he served as Executive Director of the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security, Chief Advisor to the Vice Chairman of the House Armed Service Committee and the Vice Chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, and to the Chairman of the Terrorism Panel. He was also Executive Director of the United States Nuclear Strategy Forum. Earlier in his career, he was an intelligence officer with the Central Intelligence Agency responsible for analyzing Soviet and Russian nuclear strategy. Peter, great to have you back, although I'm a little terrified of our topic. You've spent your life studying strategic matters, and in particular, what Russia has been doing and China has been doing in matters nuclear. What was the impetus for writing this report?
Well, I'm very concerned that the Biden administration may ban unilaterally the U.S. intercontinental ballistic missiles, which is critical to the nuclear triad that we rely upon to deter nuclear war. You know, the triad comprises ICBMs, our strategic bombers, and our ballistic missile submarines. And the Biden administration, anti-nuclear activists like Plowshares, Union of Concerned Scientists, Federation of American Scientists, have become extremely influential, more so than they have ever been in the past. They've become an important part of the Democrat Party's political base. And people from these organizations are being promoted into the Biden administration with their anti-nuclear views. Some of the leaders of the Democrat Party, Adam Smith, who's the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee right now, and arguably, well, after the president and after the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, is the third most important guy, perhaps the second most important guy in our country when it comes to nuclear policy, and he wants to ban the ICBMs too. The Biden administration has given our ICBMs a reprieve this year. You know, they're going to continue to fund this thing called the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, which is a replacement for the Minuteman III ICBM, which has reached the end of its useful service life. You know, it can't be extended anymore. But there's a nuclear posture review coming up in next January, that's going to re-examine all these questions. And people contributing to that nuclear posture review are going to be a lot of these anti-nuclear activists, and it can provide political cover for the president to then ban ICBMs or to not provide a modernization replacement for the Minuteman III, which will be in effect the same thing as a ban on ICBMs.
Now, the ICBMs, we have 400 missile silos located mainly in the middle of the United States, and those are underground missiles that are aimed at firing intercontinentally over to Europe, Russia, China, whatever, in the instance of war. Is that an accurate description of ICBMs?
Mostly, yeah. There's 400 Minuteman III ICBMs that are deployed in our force, and they are in hardened missile silos. They would have to attack with a nuclear weapon to destroy them, but they're not aimed at Russia and China. One of the things we have done to try to persuade Russia and China that we're not a threat to them is we have detargeted our ICBMs. So they're not aimed at Russia and China. They're aimed at broad ocean areas. Just in case, for example, there was an accidental launch that they would go into the sea and they would not strike another country.
So the ICBMs are part of what's called the triad.
Yes,
And the other two pieces are strategic bombers and submarines.
that's right.
What's the state of our strategic bombing force now?
Well, most people think, that it's like the way it was in the Cold War, where we have bombers armed with nuclear weapons constantly on patrol in the air. But that hasn't been the case for decades. After the Cold War, we grounded the bomber fleet. For a while, they were on strip alert, ready to take off on short notice. That situation doesn't exist. The bombers basically don't have nuclear weapons on them. They're not on strip alert. It would take 3 days to mobilize the strategic bomber force. And we used to have over 40 SAC bases, 40 strategic bomber bases. Those have been reduced to 3. So all of our strategic bombers are now concentrated on 3 bases.
So most of us, unfortunately, get a lot of our ideas about this from Dr. Strangelove, the
Exactly.
movie. And there's the image of Slim Pickens flying around in his B-52 with his cowboy hat on. That isn't happening anymore.
It isn't happening anymore, no. We don't have bombers on day-to-day patrols like that anymore. It would take us 3 days to mobilize the bomber force. It's called generating the force.
So you mentioned this in your title. We'll talk about it in depth later. But surprise attacks. So in the event of surprise, the bombers are not really ready to come into action with any alacrity.
The bombers would be completely destroyed in a surprise attack, and even North Korea could do it because there's only 3 targets.
Then the other piece, the third piece, are the nuclear submarines. And we have, 20 nuclear submarines, 16 nuclear
No,
submarines?
we've got 14.
14.
During the height of the Cold War, we used to have about 35 to 40, okay, which meant that we could have about a third of that force on patrol, about 12 to 14, constantly on patrol. Now we only have 14, which means that we, on a daily basis, have about 2 or 3 of them on patrol in the Atlantic or Pacific. The rest of them, 10 submarines, 11 sometimes, are in port, where they could be destroyed in a surprise attack.
Well, this seems...
And there's also only 2 ports to attack. So even North Korea could do that too. It takes only 5 weapons to destroy the bomber force, which is not alerted, and to take out 2/3 of the ballistic missile submarine fleet, when it is not generated. 5 weapons. North Korea could do that.
North Korea and China could also
Oh,
do
of course,
it, and
Russia
Russia
could
could
do it.
also
China,
do it.
even Iran could do it, even though they don't have nuclear weapons, because the bombers are not in a hardened facility, and neither are the submarines. Iran, for example, has the Club K missile from China, so it could turn any freighter into a potential missile launch platform and use anti-ship missiles, for example, to destroy those submarines in port. It could similarly use missiles like that to go after the bomber bases and destroy the bombers where they are with conventional weapons.
Well, there's the talk about, I want to get your term right, about the nuclear balance or the arsenal we have. And one of the points you make is we've got a theoretical arsenal of 5,000 warheads or whatever compared to China's number and Russia's number. Now, those headline numbers are not the real numbers.
Those are not the real numbers. Those are the numbers the press usually cites, because those are the numbers that are usually put out by anti-nuclear groups like the Federation of American Scientists or the Union of Concerned Scientists, because they like to make it sound like the United States and Russia, certainly the United States, has got a lot more nuclear weapons that are operational than it really has. Those are what are called stockpiled weapons. Those are the weapons in a stockpile. In other words, we have something like 5,000 weapons in the nuclear stockpile, but those weapons are not operational. They're not available to bombers, they're not available to submarines, they're not on ICBMs. They're warehoused someplace, many of them waiting dismantlement. Many of them are too old, and they're being used to keep the other nuclear weapons that are operational. Most Americans don't realize that the nuclear weapons that are on our ICBMs, bombers, and submarines are older than the Reagan administration. They're the same weapons that Ronald Reagan built or before the Reagan administration. These weapons are way past their design life. They should have been retired a long time ago, and we keep them alive by patching them up and taking parts from the stockpile to keep those nuclear weapons active. We really have, under the START Treaty, the new START Treaty, we're permitted 1,550 strategic weapons, operational strategic weapons. And we have less than that operational. We've got about 1,300 to 1,400 operational strategic weapons on our bombers, ICBMs. So the numbers that are actually available are much less than the stockpiled numbers.
Well, if they've just been sitting there, how do we know they'll work?
Well, that's a matter of great controversy. There's this thing called, that was established during the Clinton administration, called the Nuclear Stockpile Stewardship Program. I wrote a report on this when I worked on the House Armed Services Committee.
Right.
And the late, great Floyd Spence, who was the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, didn't want that. He didn't want the Nuclear Stockpile Stewardship Program, science-based so-called, because what it did is it ended nuclear testing. You see, Bill Clinton wanted us to sign on to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and do no more nuclear testing. But in order to do that, they had to make a case, well, we can continue to maintain and have confidence in our nuclear deterrent, by not testing them, but by having scientists look at the bombs and examine the bombs and do calculations and use computer models to certify that these nuclear weapons will still work. So that's what we've been doing for 30 years. It's kind of equivalent. Suppose we were talking about an airliner instead of a nuclear weapon. And suppose you had a Boeing 747, okay? And you said, well, I'm not going to fly that Boeing 747 for 30 or 40 years, but I'm going to have people who are smart engineers, and engineers who didn't design the 747, mind you, because those people have passed away or are in retirement. But we'll have some smart kids, with their pocket calculators and computers and models of how a 747 is supposed to work, inspect the parts, never turn it on, never fly it for 30 or 40 years. And then, we're going to certify to Congress that this thing will still fly based on this kind of scientific analysis. I would not get in that 747 and trust my life to it after it hadn't flown for 30 to 40 years. And I don't think any normal, intelligent person would do it. But that's what we're expecting with our nuclear weapons. And many of our best scientists, like Dr. John Foster and Lowell Wood, Dr. Foster, by the way, designed most of the nuclear weapons that are in our current missile inventory, have said, this science-based stockpile stewardship thing doesn't work. This is really dangerous. Every year that goes on decreases the confidence that these weapons will actually be safe and reliable and work. And people who have worked in the stockpile stewardship program, after they've retired from Los Alamos and Livermore, have written articles warning that, we were in this program and we're concerned that the credibility of these weapons is decreasing. Now, to add the cherry on top to this story, it turns out last year the State Department, which is always the last one to admit when an arms control treaty is being violated, the State Department finally admitted last year that Russia and China have been violating the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty for 30 years. And they've been conducting low-yield testing all this time that we haven't been doing the testing. This has given them an enormous technological lead over us. We're basically 30 years behind Russia and China in developing new technology, advanced nuclear weapons.
You're watching The Bill Walton Show, and I'm here with Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, and we're talking about, really, it sounds like the deplorable state of our nuclear arsenal and how we've let things deteriorate over the last 3 decades. And it seems like principally because of ideological reasons, we've decided to unilaterally disarm. Is that a fair way to talk about this?
Yes, I think so. And it's a bipartisan fault, too, because this has happened across Republican and Democrat administrations. I think with this new administration, and with the Obama administration and this new administration, the Biden administration, have been worse on this. But for both parties, and the strategic culture in Washington and in America's whole among people who tend to think about this is, well, nuclear war is unthinkable anyway. We'll never have a nuclear war because it's unthinkable. You can't win a nuclear war. And therefore, we can afford to neglect this area, except for people in Stratcom and who are real specialists in this. Your average person in Washington who's involved in the national security community thinks that way. That's part of our strategic culture, but it's not part of the strategic culture of our potential adversaries. In their military doctrine, they write about how to fight and win nuclear wars. They don't buy in to the U.S. Western view that nuclear weapons are unusable, that they can only be used for deterrent. I mean, President Biden just yesterday, had a public statement now with Vladimir Putin saying, "Oh, a nuclear war can't be won, and we must never have one," in a public statement. On the Russian side, that's a lie, because in the Russian military doctrine and strategic forces exercises that they constantly conduct, and in which Vladimir Putin personally participates in launching forces, unlike on our side, they play out games where they fight and win nuclear wars.
So how did we come to this point? I mean, I must admit, until I read your report, I was in the category of, well, nuclear war is not going to happen. It's unthinkable. Everybody understands you can't win one. While they've been testing their weapons, they've also been developing new weapons, which are a lot more lethal, stealthy, tactical almost than we think of as the bombs that went off in World War II.
That's right. They have a wide range of new weapons, as do the Chinese, but especially the Russians, that ranging from ultra-low yield tactical nuclear weapons that might have a yield of 1 kiloton. That's equivalent to 1,000 tons of TNT. Okay, it's like 1/20th the power of the Hiroshima bomb. That is pure fusion, and so it produces no fallout. And it could be used, for example, to destroy a bridge or to take out an adversary's armored division. And then you could just roll your tanks right through that area, through the blasted enemy lines. Things like neutron weapons, ultra low yield neutron weapons, which are designed for taking out armored units or would be great for anti-aircraft and anti-space purposes. X-radiation weapons, which is another way of arming anti-ballistic missile systems. One of the ones that I find most worrisome is super EMP weapons. These are weapons designed basically to put out gamma rays. They can have a very low yield, but they put out extraordinarily powerful electromagnetic pulse fields that can cover a huge area, and fields that are more intense, for example, 100,000 volts per meter, that exceed the military hardening standard, which is 50,000 volts per meter on our side. So theoretically, and the EMP Commission warned about this, you could use a super EMP weapon, to win a nuclear war, potentially with very few weapons, maybe even just one, because it could fry our ICBMs in their silos, the bombers on their bases, the ballistic missile submarines, and cut off our means of communicating with the submarines at sea, the small number of submarines at sea, so that they couldn't receive emergency action messages, which are necessary for them to execute their forces. They need to get unlocking codes, or the missiles on the submarines are useless.
Well, we hear that nobody can win a nuclear war. Mm-hmm. You disagree?
Yes, not only I disagree, but the Russians and Chinese disagree too, and you can tell by reading their military doctrine. And it's really just a matter of common sense. You don't have to be a nuclear strategist to understand that. For example, World War II is a nuclear war. Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened during World War II, and we won that war. And this establishes a principle that anybody should be able to understand, that a nuclear state, nuclear weapon state, a state that has nuclear weapons, is clearly going to be able to win decisively against any state that doesn't have nuclear weapons. And that's most of the world. Most of the world doesn't have nuclear weapons. And so that gives North Korea, China, Russia, Iran. I believe Iran already has nuclear weapons, but when they get nuclear weapons, they're,
Well, does China believe they could win a nuclear war against the United States?
Yeah, I think they do, and I think they could. And another aspect of winning a nuclear war that I would like to explore here, and because this is not another issue that isn't widely understood, is one of the things that's most attractive about nuclear weapons and makes them strategic weapons is you don't actually have to use them to win, okay? The late, great Colin Gray, who was one of the West's greatest strategic thinkers, argued, and I think correctly, that since the invention of nuclear weapons, that every war that has ever been fought, either between the superpowers or between allies involving the superpowers, has been, in effect, a nuclear war. Because when military and political leaders engage in these wars, always looming in the background, shaping the mental and psychological geography of the conduct of that war, is the reality of nuclear weapons. And so their planning and what they do is greatly influenced by that.
Well, that influenced our conduct of the Vietnam War.
Sure, Lyndon Johnson wouldn't invade North Vietnam,
Yeah.
because he was afraid, as in the invasion of North Korea during the Korean War, it would bring in China and get us into a nuclear war with China. And so we lost the Vietnam War, due to, in part to the nuclear deterrence of China. We managed to avoid both of the Berlin crises from becoming world wars because of our tactical nuclear weapons and the strategic weapons that we had. John F. Kennedy managed to keep the Cuban Missile Crisis from becoming a thermonuclear war, and he won the Cuban Missile Crisis because we had a 5-to-1 superiority over the Soviet Union at that time in ICBMs. Why has nobody done anything to except economic sanctions against Russia, for seizure of Crimea and for, in effect, seizing part of Ukraine, even though we have given security guarantees to Ukraine? It's because they're a nuclear weapons state. And so we are deterred from pushing too hard or pushing back too much against Russia because they're a nuclear weapons state. So there are many cases you can go through, examples, historical precedents where the existence of nuclear weapons has shaped decisions, and in effect, people have won wars or gotten away with crises or engaged in aggressive behavior successfully because of nuclear weapons. The put down by the Soviet Union of the Hungarian Revolution in the 1950s, their put down of the Czech revolt in 1968. Why didn't we do anything? Why didn't we go in and help the Hungarians and the Czechs? Because we didn't want to get in a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Our very victory in the Cold War, they had a 5-to-1 superiority in tanks. If it was just a matter of conventional forces, the Soviet Union during most of the Cold War could have conquered NATO and gone to the English Channel. They didn't do it. Why? Because they were deterred by U.S. nuclear weapons. And in the end, our intelligent use of nuclear deterrence, our intelligent use of nuclear strategy enabled us to prevail and defeat the Soviet Union without it becoming a thermonuclear war, almost bloodlessly, because they were crushed, because communism didn't work.
Yeah.
And they were crushed under the burden of their own economy, but they didn't roll the dice on trying to reverse their verdict of history, because of nuclear deterrence. And we won that. But we seem to have, as in so many cases with wars, we seem to have forgotten the lessons of why we won the Cold War and the role that nuclear weapons played in that. But they have learned that, the nuclear advantage, the role that nuclear weapons played in a U.S. victory in the Cold War is something that they need to take advantage of in the new Cold War that we're currently prosecuting. And unfortunately, we've allowed the strategic balance to get very much in their favor, very much in the favor of Russia at least. And I think it's actually in the favor of China too, because I think we're grossly underestimating the size and competency of the Chinese nuclear arsenal.
Talk about the virtual Great Wall in China.
Right, the underground Great Wall. Right, we didn't know about this for many years. And I think some of the best analysis on this doesn't come out of our intelligence community, which often produces, it has people who are, maybe I shouldn't get into beating up on my old agency, but I do think that the process that happens in
Your old agency being the CIA.
Right.
We did a show a few weeks ago on a woke CIA.
Oh, my goodness, God, what's that?
Which is a broke CIA.
That's right. I don't know how we are going to be able to survive without a really competent intelligence community.
Anyway, I'd interrupt, but I want to get you continue.
Well, one of the great failings, I think, of intelligence community analysis and why they so often get things wrong is that in the intelligence community culture, there's an insistence on a corporate view. They have to establish a corporate view. So you have to have a majority of analysts, for example, agree on an assessment. And in any organization, you've got a few brilliant people, a lot of average people, and then a few stupid people, okay? And when you average it all out, what you come out with is a mediocre assessment. It's a middle of the road kind of an assessment on those things. But the brilliant people, they don't prevail, okay? It's a middle of the road kind of an assessment. when you're dealing with independent analysts, however, there are brilliant people who get to say what they really think, and they usually tend to be right. At least I think the historical record shows that. There was an experiment called the B team experiment. Richard Pipes, for example, the Harvard expert on the Soviet Union and Russia, was a member of the B team that was brought in to assess during the Cold War whether the intelligence community was right about Russian military strategy and how they thought about things, because the intelligence community was saying, well, the Russians and the Soviets tend to think the way we do. They believe in mutual assured destruction. They can't win a nuclear war, these people who were saying that were unread in the literature, I think, or they were in denial. And the B team demonstrated that they were wrong about this. And in the aftermath of the Cold War, when we got hold of the Soviet archives about, what did they really think and what were they planning, it turned out the B team, was right. Today, on the issue of China, there was a brilliant guy named Phil Carver who broke the story on the underground Great Wall and said, when you look at the size of the Chinese nuclear arsenal, we're saying they've only got 200 weapons. They could actually fit a ballistic missile force that could carry 3,000 weapons in the underground Great Wall, which, by the way, belongs to China's strategic rocket forces. It's part of their nuclear deterrent. Why do they have an underground Great Wall?
So the underground Great Wall is part of their Space Force.
Well, it's part of their nuclear.
Okay. Well, you're watching the Bill Walton Show. I'm here with Peter Pry, and we're talking about the failure of our intelligence community to very often understand the nature of the true threat we faces, first with Russia and now with China. And we're learning about the virtual Great Wall, which, as I understand it, is 5,000 kilometers long.
That's right.
Or 3,000 miles. I mean, that's extraordinary.
What we've been able to verify, yes. We don't know what we don't know, but we do know it's at least that big.
So we don't know. We didn't know about that. Now we knew about that because of an entrepreneurial independent analyst that found it out. Where was our CIA on this one? Did they not see this?
They weren't looking for it, because during the Cold War, the overwhelming amount of our attention was focused on the Soviet Union. China during the Cold War was a U.S. ally, and there has also been a tendency in the intelligence community, which is a problem that exists today, I think, to have so-called panda huggers, in charge of the China desk. They tend to take a very sympathetic view toward China. We saw this at the end of the Trump administration, where there was a great debate, over the nature of the threat posed by China, with the China analysts in the intelligence community trying to soften it down and soften the assessments about how much of a threat China was to the United States.
So swinging back to the ICBMs, because I wanted to get some context before we went into why it would be such a catastrophe to get rid of them. Three pieces of the triad: bombers, ICBMs, submarines. Submarines, there are not that many out on the waters. They could be really cut off with an EMP event that would shut off their communication. We couldn't get to them. Bombers are sitting on the ground unarmed. But what people say about the ICBMs is they could be a hair trigger, and that the greatest danger is not Russian bolt, but a U.S. blunder, and that somehow these ICBMs sitting there ready to go, and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which is anything, once something starts, both sides are going to be destroyed. All those things are part of this push right now to get rid of the ICBMs.
Yes, that's right. The very virtue of the ICBMs, the fact that they are on such a high level of readiness, over 95% of those ICBMs, our Minuteman III ICBMs, are ready to go, in a few minutes, 3 minutes after they get an emergency action message from the president, they can launch. And the reason that's necessary on a day-to-day basis is that they are really our only defense against a surprise nuclear attack from the other side. They're intended to deter the other side making a surprise nuclear attack. We try to deter them from launching this first strike, and it has worked so far all through the Cold War up until today, because they know those ICBMs are ready to go. And can they beat us to the draw? Can they strike those ICBMs and take them out before we can launch them? That's the issue. Now, how much of a hair trigger is that? Well, we've gone to extraordinary lengths to try to, I think it's really exaggerated, the idea that our ICBMs pose this kind of a hair-trigger threat to nuclear war. First, the United States, our political leaders and military leaders believe in nuclear deterrence, not nuclear war fighting, not striking first. We don't do nuclear Pearl Harbors.
Our
okay?
defensive, our armament's all defensive to deter, and theirs is offensive to strike.
Yes, that's right. That's the doctrine, and I think it's reflected in the characteristic of the forces. To go back to our Minuteman III, to just make a couple points about this, as I mentioned earlier, our Minuteman III force is detargeted. It's not aimed on their missile silos and bomber bases. It's aimed on broad ocean areas. So in case there is some kind of a mistake, the missiles would go into the ocean. But emergency action messages to launch missiles, we go through a threat conference. There's a process where we need dual phenomenology. You've got to have radar confirmation. You've got to have a satellite confirmation that the United States is under attack. That's why we have NORAD, our best experts looking at an incoming threat to assess whether the threat is real or not. So we would not execute those forces lightly. Moreover, we have downloaded, the Minuteman used to be MIRVed. It carried more than one warhead, had 3 warheads, okay? But we've demerved it so that each warhead could attack a different independent target.
MIRV stands for multiple
independently targetable reentry vehicle.
Okay, so.
And we deliberately downloaded it to 1 warhead. That's not optimal for making a first strike, because that means only one missile can only destroy 1 target. And there are more strategic targets in Russia and China than there are Minuteman missiles to execute that first strike. But look at what the Russians and Chinese are doing. They have not followed our lead. We have reasons to believe they've cheated on the detargeting agreement, by the way, and they have heavily MIRVed their ICBMs. Russia's newest ICBM, the DF-41, carries 10 MIRVed warheads, and it's mobile. It's kind of equivalent to a mobile peacekeeper missile. And China's new ICBM, called the Satan II by NATO, or the Sarmat by the Russians, is capable of carrying up to 40 MIRVed warheads. Why do you heavily MIRV? Because one missile, can take out, many targets. There's basically, the 400 ICBM silos, 3 bomber bases, there's a lot less than 500 strategic targets in the United States for a counterforce attack.
And how many could North Korea reach? They could get the bomber bases and the submarine bases.
They could get the bomber bases and submarine bases. They don't have the capability to take out our ICBMs yet.
Yeah.
Because they've only got about, 60 warheads. I think they've got more than that. But even my estimate, that's not enough to do that unless they do a super EMP attack. It's possible, because a super EMP...
Quickly describe EMP. We did a show on it, but just...
Right.
Electromagnetic pulse. What that does, you explode something and it really shuts down all the electronic communication devices.
Right. This is it's not detonating on a city. The weapon is detonated at high altitude. For example, at 300 kilometers altitude, you could put an electromagnetic field over North America with a single weapon. And if you can raise the intensity of that field high enough, it can exceed the military hardening standard, which is 50,000 volts per meter. That's what we hardened our forces to. And the EMP Commission, this isn't just my opinion, but gave testimony to Congress back in 2008 that North Korea has super EMP weapons, and because these weapons can generate extraordinarily powerful EMP fields, 100,000 volts per meter, for example, they could attack each of the Minuteman wings, with 1 of these. There's only 6. Even during the Cold War, we only had 6 Minuteman wings. And, if you put a field down on each of those wings, you could potentially fry the electronics and the missiles, and the bombers are usually co-located with these things. And so potentially, possibly, it's conceivable North Korea could win a nuclear war against us by means of EMP attack, by disarming us. By win a nuclear war, I mean make a disarming attack. They wouldn't be attacking our cities, but they'd be attacking our forces and disarming our forces. And how would we respond to that? Would we be able to respond? Maybe we wouldn't even be able to launch our ballistic missile submarines, the 2 or 3 of them that are at sea, because they would be disconnected from emergency action messages.
Let me let me do some conventional wisdom here.
Sure.
Conventional wisdom was forever China was okay because we're helping China become more democratic. We're helping them become wealthy. We're having them enter the Western liberal world. Well, now in the last several years, particularly since Xi became so aggressive, it's now clear that that's not what they have in mind. The Chinese Communist Party is very aggressive, and they have plans, particularly territorial plans with regard to Taiwan. Russia, conventional wisdom, I thought, well, the Soviet Union fell. It's been a kleptocracy. Putin's a thug, but they've got no industrial capability to speak of, and they're not modernizing their weapons, and so therefore we don't really have to worry about Russia. North Korea, it's run by a little madman, and we don't have to worry about him because and the capability they brag about is not real. I'm sitting here listening to Peter Pry, and with the sinking feeling, I'm realizing, no, wait a second, all three of these entities are serious threats.
Yes, that's right. All three of those entities are potentially mortal threats, existential threats, far more serious than climate change is to the existence of the United States and
climate change. Oh, that's
and the Western democracies, and the conventional wisdom. We have always been disadvantaged when it comes to totalitarian states, when it comes to weapons of mass destruction, and particularly nuclear weapons. Because of our strategic culture, and there's kind of no getting around that, the strategic culture of the Western democracies doesn't like to think about world wars, nuclear wars, end of the world. We're a culture of optimists. We believe tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday. And anything that tends to contradict that comfortable assumption, we tend to want to deny it. And this was true even before the invention of nuclear weapons. If you look at the thinking of the Western democracies, including the United States, before World War II, you had people who were pacifists, who were just as aggressive, not against nuclear weapons, but against any weapons. They were against the Western democracies arming up to be able to deter Hitler and Imperial Japan and Mussolini. You had they believed that World War I was caused by the merchants of death. But they believed that the weapons of mass destruction at the time, that the machine gun and the invention of the strategic bomber, the conventional strategic bomber, would be the end of the world, for everybody. Because World War I looked like the end of the world. From the point of view of the Western democracies, there were so many casualties. And how could any rational person think about a World War II? That was the attitude, that World War II was unthinkable to 90% of the intellectuals and political leaders that lived in that interwar period. Only Winston Churchill and a handful of strategic experts who surrounded him saw what was coming. And the situation, I think, is analogous to today, where we want to blind ourselves and blinker ourselves and not think about nuclear warfighting, nuclear strategy. We want to deny. We want to say nuclear weapons and nuclear warfare is unthinkable. And there's an additional aspect to this that makes us particularly vulnerable, because the truth is that nuclear weapons are antithetical to the fundamental philosophies of free societies. Our greatest value is to serve the people. The people are the most important, valuable thing. So weapons of mass destruction like nuclear weapons are really antithetical to our most fundamental values. We were always sort of fated to lose an arms race in nuclear weapons to adversaries who are not free systems, who are centralized totalitarian systems, and whose highest value is placed, because they are totalitarian states, on being able to destroy their adversaries and control their adversaries and win with or without nuclear war. And I would say that we're actually engaged in a nuclear war right now with Russia and China and North Korea, and we're losing it. We're losing it at the diplomatic level, because nuclear weapons, as Colin Gray observed, are used, not part of their greatest value is to actually employ them as diplomatic tools for blackmail. That's how we won the Cold War. We didn't actually detonate a nuclear weapon against the Soviet Union, but we deterred them for long enough so that they collapsed, from their own internal contradictions. Look what's happening in the Pacific just against North Korea. How credible are our security guarantees to Japan, South Korea, the Philippines? How credible Are we winning against China in terms of the South China Sea? You know, they have in effect annexed the South China Sea. We protest, we complain about it. We haven't done anything about it because they're a nuclear power. The strategy here is, for example, for China and North Korea, is to make the risks of underwriting our security guarantees to our allies in the Pacific so dangerous, you know, that they will lose faith that we would deliver on those security guarantees and that we might eventually withdraw from the Pacific. And indeed, it didn't get a lot of attention, but one of the biggest pieces on the chessboard of the Pacific, you know, is that we had B-52 bombers based in Guam. You know, basically a wing of B-52 bombers that was a core of credibility for us. And we took them out because of the North Korean nuclear threat and pulled them back to, I think it was Minot Air Force Base. And, you know, the Air Force position was...
We pulled them back because we thought they were a target, or we pulled them back because we didn't want to seem too aggressive?
We pulled them back because we knew they were a target. Kim, in 2017, during the nuclear crisis under Trump, threatened to strike Guam. And we knew the Chinese had the ability, too, to strike Guam.
Why aren't we hearing more about this? I mean, there have got to be a lot of people like you that are close to this whole national security apparatus. And where are the voices? Why is this not being... In so many other areas, if you get into politics, there seemed to be a blackout on things, talking about things like January 6th or the election. But there seems to be a blackout on this kind of news blackout on reporting this kind of risk.
Yeah, I think it's explainable in part by our strategic culture. You know, the left-wing mainstream media certainly is anti-nuclear on everything. They're always against any kind of a modernization.
Well, they call you the root of all evil. I'm reading the letter from the head of the Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Right. Yeah, people like me are the root of all evil because we won't give peace a chance by making a unilateral gesture of, for example, banning our ICBMs.
Seems to me like you just described 30, 40 years of unilateral gestures.
In that
We've
letter,
been making them time after time after time.
We have. You know, starting with tactical nuclear weapons, right across the board. In that letter, I explained, you know, we gave peace a chance after the end of the Cold War.
This is a letter back to Dr. Irwin, whatever.
Right. I don't want to mention the last okay. But the the presidential nuclear initiative.
Right.
Russia and the United States agreed that we were going to dismantle our tactical nuclear weapons. We had 15,000 tactical nuclear weapons during the Cold War, and we've reduced the number to 180. Russia didn't do that. You know, they cheated on the presidential nuclear initiative. Now they have an at least 10-to-1 advantage in tactical nuclear weapons. Plus, they cheated on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, as I noted before. We haven't tested in 30 years. They did. China and Russia both. And now they have advanced technology, tactical and strategic weapons. We have no counterparts to them are in inventory. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, you know, was supposed to abolish a whole category of weapons, intermediate range nuclear missiles. We dismantled our Pershing IIs and our Glickums. You know, they no longer exist. Turns out that Russia cheated on that too, and they have a unilateral advantage in intermediate range nuclear forces, and they're probably cheating on the New START treaty. The State Department is always the last one to acknowledge when these arms control treaties are being violated. They are still contending that Russia is in compliance with the New START treaty. But independent experts, you know, people whose judgment I trust most on these things, assess that Russia probably is cheating on the New START treaty and probably has a 2-to-1 advantage in long-range strategic nuclear weapons, at least over us. And it's not hard to see why you should draw that conclusion, because the verification provisions in the New START treaty are abysmal. You know, we really can't verify that treaty.
Well, after all of these series of I guess, strategic blunders, tactical retreats, whatever, through the last 3 or 4 decades, you're saying we're now, though, at an even more, what's your phrase for the point in time we're in now with regard to the ICBMs?
Oh, I liken it to the hinge of fate. You know, the decision we're making now about, do we modernize the Minuteman III, replace the Minuteman III with a new ICBM, the ground-based strategic deterrent, which is the replacement for the Minuteman III. Do we do that to keep the triad alive to try to sustain the credibility of the triad of nuclear deterrence, which is what enabled us to prevail in the nuclear Cold War without having a World War III? Or are we going to be so foolish and blind that we're going to get rid of those 400 ICBMs and their hardened silos, which will make it possible for even North Korea to win a nuclear war against us by a surprise attack?
What about the votes? Is this something that Congress votes on, or is this something that happens in the Defense Department? What's the political process towards this decision?
There are votes that have to be taken, and there's negotiations that are going to happen this summer between the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. The House Armed Services Committee, that has been chaired by Adam Smith, they want to ban ICBMs. They want to get rid of them, or not fund the ground-based strategic deterrent, which is the same thing as eliminating our ICBM force, because the Minuteman III is at the end of its service life. It can't continue and be a credible deterrent. And this issue will be decided this summer. Now, I think we'll win this time, but only because the Biden administration, has not come in on the side of the anti-nuclear forces in Congress and said, yeah, we're defunding the ground-based strategic deterrent. They've allowed the funding to be there. Still, who knows what's going to happen? The argument, the battle is going to go on this summer, and negotiations are going to continue. My concern is that there's going to be a nuclear posture review under the Biden administration in January, and they're bringing in all kinds of anti-nuclear people.
January 2022.
January 2022, a new nuclear posture review. And they're bringing in all kinds of anti-nuclear people from Union of Concerned Scientists, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, who have senior positions in the nuclear enterprise, who will no doubt inform and participate in the new nuclear posture review. And I'm very concerned that the new nuclear posture review will give the Biden administration the political cover it wants and needs, so that it can make this unilateral grand gesture that the anti-nuclear forces want and say, well, we're going to abolish U.S. ICBMs and hope that China and Russia follow our leads. Or we're not going to fund the follow-on ICBM, the ground-based strategic deterrent, and we're going to extend the Minuteman III, which is another possible way of basically banning ICBMs while pretending to have a functional ICBM force.
So what should we do, people, those of us listening and watching, what's our line of action here?
I think people should, reach out to their members of Congress and to their senators and say, we want you on the right side of this. Our lives are at stake in this. The future of America and the Western democracies are at stake. Do not defund the ground-based strategic deterrent. Replace the Minuteman III with a new ICBM. I would like to even go beyond that. And one of the things I recommend in the report, is that we finally realize Ronald Reagan's dream. Because I too have reservations. I break company with a lot of my nuclear hawk colleagues on how long can we go with nuclear deterrence, without getting into a nuclear war. I think it's increasingly unstable because of the kinds of technologies that are being developed increasingly favor striking first and achieving surprise attack. Hypersonic warheads is just one example. Here are weapons that can basically evade our radars, greatly reduce our strategic warning time, maneuver so that they can't, so that the existing national missile defenses can't intercept them, and have extraordinary accuracy. So you can basically blow up a hardened target, with very low yield. This is the dream that people who believe in nuclear warfighting and nuclear war and winning nuclear wars in Russia and China, have been waiting for, and eventually, I'm afraid of us getting into a 1914 or 1940, 1939 type scenario where the temptation to strike us will be so great because the advantages of the offense will be so great that Russia, China, or North Korea will find it irresistible. The way to get out of the nuclear deterrence trap is not by disarming yourself and by making futile gestures, of unilaterally disarming yourself. The way to do it, there is a way out, and Ronald Reagan had that vision. It's the way historically, you can render military technologies obsolete by coming up with a better more stable military technology. And Reagan's vision of a space-based missile shield, to render nuclear missiles obsolete, that's the way out. Come up with a better system. And we did, actually. It was called Brilliant Pebbles. And it was ready for deployment during the Clinton administration. This was the fruit of Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative that the mainstream left-wing press never likes to talk about, because they're also against missile defenses. So is the Physicians for Social Responsibility, by the way. They don't want us to defend ourselves or deploy missile defenses. But space-based missile defenses, we still have great technological capabilities, I believe, still have an advantage over our adversaries. And this is the way of rendering mutual assured destruction obsolete. I talk about replacing it with a new strategic doctrine called strategic assured national existence, or SANE. The American people don't want to be avenged in the event of a nuclear war. Yeah. After our children and our cities are destroyed, they want to be protected.
Right.
How can anyone be against, but they are, how can anyone be against a system that kills nuclear missiles and not people? And that's how we could transition out of it. Reagan even wanted to share the technology, and I wouldn't be against that, because if you get into a strategic defensive arms race, all the sides become safer and more secure. It makes more and more obsolete the offensive strategies and offensive weapons that are currently putting us at such great peril.
Peter, thank you. You've been watching the Bill Walton Show, and I've been talking with a serious man, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, on a serious topic, which is nuclear warfare, and I think I've made some progress to understand what's at stake and what we can do about it. Peter, thanks for offering up a solution. I'd like to have you back at some point, sometime, to get into this a little further to see where we can take it, because this is one of the most vital issues Americans will face, much more important than a lot of the silly things we see in the headlines. So stay tuned to this and future shows on this topic. And Peter, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for joining. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Want more? Click the subscribe button or head over to thebillwaltonshow.com to choose from over 100 episodes. You can also learn more about our guest on our Interesting People page. And send us your comments. We read every one, and your thoughts help us guide the show. If it's easier for you to listen, check out our podcast page and subscribe there. In return, we'll keep you informed about what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks for joining.